computer. Okay, and now I'm going to spotlight myself for everyone. Okay. Good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are, everyone. This is our, I think it's our fourth meeting, something like that, maybe fifth meeting for the Society of the Spectacle. And we're going through it at a leisurely pace. And so I'm just going to plunge right in. At our last meeting, we read most of chapter 3, which is called Unity and Division Within Appearances. The last ones that we read and we discussed a little bit, but I'll kind of remind you of them going in here, was section 64 and 65. And this is where Debord is talking about two different types of spectacle, the concentrated and the diffuse. And the concentrated is like Nazi Germany, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, that kind of thing. To some extent, Saddam's Iraq. You know, you have to a certain degree where you have these highly concentrated things where normally it's focused on one leader and on the, you know, that kind of thing. And it's usually in the more backward regions because the diffuse spectacle, which is more like what we live in, United States or Western Europe or Japan, you know, other more modern countries, tends to be richer. It's got an abundance of commodities. You know, capitalism has developed relatively fully. It's had its fuck ups, but it keeps picking itself up despite wars and all this kind of thing. And its nature is apparent choice. You know, it's giving you a lot of different things to buy, even different political parties to support, and different ideas, religions, you name it, are up there. And you have the illusion, at least, that you've got a lot of choices. And you do have some choices, unlike in the concentrated spectacle, where often you've just got one choice on it. You know, if you go for something else, you might end up in jail or whatever. So I won't reread them, but you had those two different things, concentrated and diffuse. So I'll go on with 66, and this is true primarily of the diffuse spectacle, but to a certain extent. The concentrated spectacle is also capitalism. That's a key thing. It's just that it's not a competitive capitalism like we have, or an ostensibly competitive one. So 66, each individual commodity fights for itself. It avoids acknowledging the others, and strives to impose itself everywhere as if it were the only one in existence. The spectacle is the epic poem of this struggle, a struggle that no fall of Troy can bring to an end. The spectacle does not sing of men and their arms, but of commodities and their passions. Men and their arms is how the Aeneid opens. I'm singing of arms and men, you know, blah, blah, blah. So instead, we get a constant thing about commodities and their passions. In this blind struggle, each commodity, by pursuing its own passion, unconsciously generates something beyond itself, the globalization of the commodity, which also amounts to the commodification of the globe. Thus, as a result of the cunning of the commodity, while each particular manifestation of the commodity eventually falls in battle, the general commodity form continues onward toward its absolute realization. And I'll stop there just a little bit. He's deturning from Hegel there a lot. And in Hegel has this idea that the real spirit of the world, or reason with a capital R, or something like this, is what's really going through world history. But it itself does not enter into the sordid details. It sends people or things there. For example, if it needs a dictator, it raises up a dictator, and that dictator, like Alexander the Great, is going to go off and, or Napoleon or something like that. And we look at history and say, oh, Napoleon did this and conquered this and all that. But then Napoleon is defeated and so on. And who wins? Well, it's the reason, the spirit of the world is winning, and it uses the Napoleons and all of Napoleon's soldiers as just pawns, and then they don't last. So Debord is saying it's the same way with commodities. Each individual commodity doesn't you have a commodity and a year later it's outdated. It's no longer selling, and there's a new commodity replacing it. So there's no commodity that is permanent. But what is permanent is this sort of global thing, the spectacle or capitalism, however you would want to call it, that keeps on going, even though its little specifics keep destroying each other and dying off. So next section, 67. The satisfaction that no longer comes from using the commodities produced in abundance is now sought through the recognition of their value as commodities. Consumers, so a commodity, as people look at it in one sense, they think it's a thing, like it's a book or a typewriter or a table or automobile. And that's why people buy it, because it's useful. You need a car to get around, you need to, etc. But as we have already seen in previous parts of this chapter, and in Marx, a century earlier, as capitalism develops and becomes massive, with factory produced things, you get things that are produced for the purpose of selling. They're not produced really to be used. It's the use is there, but it's incidental. Like no hedge fund guy or capitalist says, oh, I want to provide use value for 1,000 people to give them a better refrigerator. That's not their thought. Their thought is, how can I make money by selling something to these people? Well, their refrigerators may be old, and if you can improve it or make it look like it's improved or something, then you can sell it. So basically, it's the exchange value, the monetary thing, that is why these things are really produced. And so a worker that is making those things, that's why the worker's doing it. It's not that workers are trying to make something for people to use. They're trying to make something because they're paid to do so by somebody else who sees this possible profit that can be made by them. It's only incidentally that we have to say, well, if you produce completely crappy stuff, nobody will buy it. It'll just be obviously ridiculous. So you have to have a veneer of that this is useful. It's got a new innovation or something. So now he's saying that since all these things, the satisfaction is not from use, but it's from, you get the idea that the commodity is a magical thing in itself. This is what Marx was talking about and Debord in our last meeting, that we arrive at a point where the commodities are just, or the spectacles that are kind of associated with them, are just kind of like magical things. And it's your own life doesn't seem like it amounts to very much because, you know, you're just being paid a small amount to do this work, and nobody else is, that's all that people are interested in. So you start identifying with these commodities because that's where the real life seems to be. Oh, if I had that snazzy car, or if I had this thing, you know, people would really think I was cool or whatever. So that's what he's talking about in this thesis. The satisfaction that no longer comes from using the commodities produced in abundance is now sought through recognition of their value as commodities. Consumers are filled with religious fervor for the sovereign freedom of commodities, whose use has become an end in itself. Waves of enthusiasm for particular products are propagated by all the communications media. A film sparks a fashion craze. A magazine publicizes night spots, which in turn spin off different lines of products. The proliferation of faddish gadgets reflects the fact that as the mass of commodities becomes increasingly absurd, absurdity itself becomes a commodity. Trinkets, such as keychains, which come as free bonuses with the purchase of some luxury product, but which end up being traded back and forth as valued collectibles in their own right, reflect a mystical self-abandonment to commodity transcendence. Those who collect trinkets that have been manufactured for the sole purpose of being collected are accumulating commodity indulgences, glorious tokens of the commodity's real presence among the faithful. This is like the indulgences that the Catholic Church used to sell for forgiveness of sins. Reified people proudly display the proofs of their intimacy with the commodity. And I mean, a crude example is people who wear a t-shirt, you know, that has Pepsi Cola or, you know, the name of a rock band or whatever that they're identifying with. Like the old religious fetishism, with its convulsionary raptures and miraculous cures, the fetishism of commodities generates its own moments of fervent arousal. All this is useful for only one purpose, producing habitual submission. Next one, the pseudo needs imposed by modern consumerism cannot be contrasted with any genuine needs or desires that are not themselves also shaped by this society and its history. Commodity abundance represents a total break in the organic development of social needs. Its mechanical accumulation unleashes an unlimited artificiality which overpowers any living desires. The cumulative power of this autonomous artificiality ends up by falsifying all social life. I'm going to read one more and then we can stop. 69. The image of blissful social unification through consumption merely postpones the consumer's awareness of the actual divisions until his next disillusionment with some particular commodity. Each new product is ceremoniously acclaimed as a unique creation, offering a dramatic shortcut to the promised land of total consummation. But as with the fashionable adoption of seemingly aristocratic first names, which end up being given to virtually all individuals of the same age, the objects that promise uniqueness can be offered up for mass consumption only if they are numerous enough to have been mass produced. The prestigiousness of mediocre objects of this kind is solely due to the fact that they have been placed, however briefly, at the center of social life and hailed as a revelation of the unfathomable purposes of production. But the object that was prestigious in the spectacle becomes mundane as soon as it is taken home by its consumer, at the same time as by all its other consumers. Too late, it reveals its essential poverty, a poverty that inevitably reflects the poverty of its production. Meanwhile, some other object is already replacing it as a justification of the system and demanding its moment of acclaim. So I'll stop there. And any comments or questions about these, I think, 4 theses? Just a minute here. Mike Bellard.
Hi. When I was reading that, I thought that what he's getting at is the old question of separation of power, that the human beings are the ones that are creating not only the abundance, which could be lived on in an administration of things, but also beyond that abundance, they're creating all of these other things, just like they created God, just like they create these abstractions. Exchange value itself is an abstraction. It's a perception of how much socially necessary labor time it takes to do something. Then you have advertising as a commodity to try to get you to buy things that maybe you should not even spend any time on. What you should be spending time on is disposable time that you have for yourself, to develop yourself as a human being, not to consume something that you've alienated from yourself, like you've alienated your power. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Ian is.
Hi, yeah. So I was wondering, at the end of the section you just read, where some other object is already replacing it as a justification of the system and demanding its own moment of acclaim. This makes me think of Andy Warhol's famous 15 minutes of fame. And I'm wondering if there is a liberatory possibility in frankly acknowledging the this sort of evanescent fame, the way that Andy Warhol did. I'm wondering how Debord's ideas would bounce off something like that.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm I don't think Debord would have been a fan of Andy Warhol, or obviously he was aware of that kind of thing. But I think people like Warhol, they're kind of operating in the system they do things that are sort of unconventional. And so they think, oh, this person is a rebellious type of person or something. And then if he does something like just paint a bunch of Campbell soup cans, they think, oh, he's making fun of the system. Yay for him. And obviously that's what in most cases is what he's doing. He's not saying, I don't think that he really thinks that the Campbell soup can or Campbell soup is great. He's presenting this maybe somewhat in the same spirit that Marcel Duchamp presented a urinal and said this and called it a fountain and put it in an art exhibit or something. But the point is with Warhol, this ends up being so cynical that it's just like, first of all, everybody doesn't get their 15 minutes of fame. He's just saying, oh, that's what it should be like. I mean, it's a sort of crude way of saying we shouldn't be watching the superstars 100% of the time. Each person should get this. But it's a kind of meaningless thing to say because not even 1% of people get that amount of fame. And even if they did, so what? It's a stupid fame, like it would be just like on the level of reality TV or something. It's just, it's kind of a bad joke. So I think Warhol is, I mean, you can look at somebody like that as a sort of symptom of the, you know, sickness of the spectacle society or something, that you have people that actually can exploit it, you know, and say, oh, I'm a specialist in stirring things up in this wacky society. And, you know, and so I'm going to give this particular actor 15 minutes of fame by filming him asleep or something, you know, and making him feel, yay, he's now famous all over the world. But he's famous for something so stupid. What does that mean? And once again, it's only a minute percentage of people that are so famous, and they must be pretty lame people, you know, that would lend themselves to that. Um, so I think I'll stop there. Judy, you got to unmute yourself. Oh, no, there
Is
you
he
go.
is he talking about that process where you'll go out and you'll see something and you'll get all excited and like, oh, I gotta have that. That's really great. I need that. And you buy it and then you bring it home and you forget about it. It's like
Yeah.
it's sort of that's what he's talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there is that on the kind of personal level.
It's a
You
very
do find
strong, I mean, it's a
yeah,
powerful thing.
yeah, and people can get excited about that, but part of the excitement is in the film, which we will see sometime not too long from now, of Society of the Spectacle. I think when he has this thing, he has uh, Pompidou at the opening of a new car or something, and Pompidou is looking at this new Renault or whatever, you know, whatever it is, and as if this is a miraculous thing, and so on. And it is, Pompidou is mediocre, the car is mediocre, it doesn't mean anything, you know. But if you imagine that maybe millions of French people were looking at that when it came out on TV or in a film or something, I don't know, whatever, on the news, you would imagine that a certain number of people, maybe not everybody, but would be excited and want to have that. Because it looks to them like that's the ticket to, you know, excitement, passion. You know, what a beautiful car. And if I was zipping around with that, or, you know, whatever fantasies they're having. And then when you actually get it, you know, you may notice that your next door neighbor got one too. And, you know, uh, again, it's like you say, with children, sometimes they get a toy and then it's a fancy toy and they never play with it. It just looked fancy and it did stuff. Uh, so yeah, there is that, you know, that a lot of it is because it's been in the spectacle. And that's part of the role of the spectacle. Um, so any other comments or questions? Okay, I'm going to just proceed here. Sooner or later, I know we'll get into some ones where we can't stop. So, number 70, the fraudulence of the satisfactions offered by the system is exposed by this continual replacement of products and of general conditions of production. In both the diffuse and the concentrated spectacle, entities that have brazenly asserted their definitive perfection nevertheless end up changing, and only the system endures. Stalin, like any other outmoded commodity, is denounced by the very forces that originally promoted him. Each new lie of the advertising industry is an admission of its previous lie. And with each downfall of a personification of totalitarian power, the illusory community that had unanimously approved him is exposed as a mere conglomeration of loners without illusions. I'm going to stop and comment on that. So the first sentence is the same thing that we were just talking about, like there's continual replacement. And the continual replacement kind of implies usually an admission of fraudulence. Like a commodity is sold, and then a year later, a new commodity that comes out and says, this commodity is great. It doesn't have all the bad things that that previous commodity does. So you have this continual, almost frantic thing, like with updates of the latest computer systems or, the latest thing and fashions and so on. So then Debord is making this very neat comparison with the concentrated and diffuse spectacles. Like, even though it's different in them, he's saying in both cases, there is this turnover. And just like we would have the automobile having a new style of automobile the following year, you have Stalin, for example, who for, 25 or more years was in totalitarian power in Russia. But I mean, to the point, like nobody could, there was never any possibility of him being overthrown or anything. He was in total control. And then he dies in 1953. And as soon as he dies, there's this, among his closest supporters, his assistants and all these kind of things, Khrushchev and Beria and Bulganin and all these people, there was a mad dash, like, what do we do now? Because they've had no experience. And they've been used to this one guy at the top deciding everybody and everybody else kissing his ass. Although some people were more powerful ass kissers than others. And so they're trying to figure out who is going to be the next Stalin. So the first thing they do is they get Beria, who was the head of the secret police, and they kill him. I mean, the next day he's killed. And then after he's safely dead, they issue a thing like saying, we have found that, Beria was a traitor and he was doing all this. But they wanted to, first of all, get him out of the way because he had the most, by the head of the secret police, obviously, is somebody you cannot leave free and go to sleep comfortably at night. So they kill him, and then they sort of struggle among themselves for 2 or 3 years, a little less violently. And so finally, Khrushchev gets to be the top guy among that bunch of people in 1956. And then there's this meeting of the Communist Party, Russia, with these thousands of people, representatives there. And he comes out with this report. It's described in the note that I wrote for this report about the limits. Let me see what I said. The limits of the quote personality cult. I said, and number 1, 2. Okay, I'll just read. After he's died, the new Russian leader, Khrushchev, initiated a de-Stalinization campaign, beginning with a, quote, secret report to the 20th Party Congress in 1956 entitled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. As the title suggests, Khrushchev's denunciation focused on Stalin as an individual who had for some unknown reason succumbed to paranoia and megalomania and dictatorial excesses, and never questioned the nature of the system in which such enormities could arise. And then blah, blah, it goes on from there. So after Khrushchev gave this speech, at first it was unofficial, but then it was intentionally leaked. People were kind of freaked out you know, because Stalin was God, you know, I mean, they had grown up never hearing a hint of anything bad about him. And now they're saying, well, yeah, he was important, you know, did some good things, but there were some excesses. You know, he got kind of carried away and da da da. And so they say now us people who have been his total supporters, you know, are now saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Actually, they continue to do a lot of the same things, as we will find out later, but they're jettisoning him just like the new commodity says, oh, the old commodity is full of shit. You don't want that, you know, you've got to get this new version. And then so each new lie is an admission of the previous lie, and with each downfall of the personification of totalitarian power, like Stalin, the illusory community, that would be Khrushchev and his buddies and all that, that had unanimously approved him, is exposed as a mere conglomeration of loners without illusions. It's beautifully put there. So Bruce, unmute yourself.
Couple of things. There's a film came out a couple of years ago, made in Britain, called The Death of Stalin. It brilliantly depicts exactly what happened inside of the top levels of the Soviet Communist Party after Stalin's death. I highly recommend it to anybody. Steve Buscemi, the guy who was the star in Boardwalk Empire, played Khrushchev, and Michael Palin from Monty Python played Molotov. And it's a brilliant movie. It really, really shows what happened, and it's really, I really
it's called The Death of
it.
Stalin.
Yeah, it's called The Death of Stalin. I really recommend it to anybody who wants to see that. The other thing is that on Khrushchev's secret speech, back in the 80s, I was a student, a political science student, and I specialized in Soviet studies. And at that time, I read the entirety of Khrushchev's secret speech. And one thing was particularly notable, and I made this point in reporting on it in an exam. The speech was meticulously crafted in such a way that it did everything to condemn Stalin, but in no way implicate Khrushchev in any of the things that Stalin had done. It was meticulously crafted to do that. In other words, to separate Stalin, separate Khrushchev completely from Stalin. And I know later on we're going to talk about Trotskyism, but there's a point I want to make about the secret speech and Trotskyism, and I recommend this too. Immediately after the secret speech was published in the West, James Cannon, who was the leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, the main Trotskyist organization in the United States, gave a speech in response to what Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. And in that speech, he predicted that the Soviet Union was on the brink, was on the verge of what he called political revolution, in which according to Trotskyist theory, the political leadership would be changed without the social and economic system being in any way, significant way, being altered. And that's a good speech to listen to. It's available on YouTube. But what struck me, of course, was that speech showed how totally wrong James Cannon was about the Soviet Union, and he was completely failed to see that the Soviet system wasn't going to change at all in any significant way, let alone there be a political revolution. So he was totally off the mark, and it's a good speech to listen to, just for the sake of really, really highlighting how wrong and how misinformed the Trotskyist critique of the Soviet Union is.
Okay, thank you. Zach.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to drag us off onto a tangent here, but I was thinking of the film The Death of Stalin as well. And I think if anyone's interested, people should be warned that it plays the terror and the mass purges and murder as slapstick comedy. It's a bizarre choice. It's an incredibly gutsy choice. When I was watching, I was trying to figure out, does this sort of count as détournement of history, or is this just in really bad taste? And I'm still not sure.
Yeah.
But it's kind of amazing that it was made by distributed by a big studio, and yeah, it's an interesting take on.
Yeah,
on that.
thanks for the clarification, Zach.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll move on to the last two in this chapter, 71. The things the spectacle presents as eternal are based on change and must change as their foundations change. The spectacle is totally dogmatic, yet it is incapable of arriving at any really solid dogma. Nothing stands still for it. This instability is the spectacle's natural condition, but it is completely contrary to its natural inclination. 72. The unreal unity proclaimed by the spectacle masks the class division underlying the real unity of the capitalist mode of production. What obliges the producers to participate in the construction of the world is also what excludes them from it. What brings people into relation with each other by liberating them from their local and national limitations is also what keeps them apart. What requires increased rationality is also what nourishes the irrationality of hierarchical exploitation and repression. What produces society's abstract power also produces its concrete lack of freedom. And I'm going to plunge right into the next chapter, which is by far the longest in the book. It's called The Proletariat as Subject and Representation. And the epigram for this is from the Parliamentary Report on the Insurrection of March 18th. That insurrection was the Paris Commune, 1871. So after the Commune was over and totally bloodily suppressed with 15 or 20,000 people just shot in cold blood, the French Parliament, as is typical with these things, they said, how did this happen? Where did this thing come from? And so they have a bunch of people, assigned to look into this and say, what was at the root of this? And Debord has managed to pick out, sometimes when people are assigned to do that, they don't do as expected. Like when in the 1960s, when you had all these black riots, like Watts and Harlem and quite a few others, Detroit and so on, LBJ, was saying, we need to, this shouldn't happen. We need to find out what's behind this. And so he appoints a committee of kind of moderate people, like a token black senator. And, he didn't appoint Martin Luther King or Stokely Carmichael or, they were moderate, conventional politicians and other people like that to investigate. And they did for months, they investigated, they interviewed thousands of people, they looked at data and all this, and they came out with this report that was book length. And the report was not what Johnson was expecting. He was expecting them to, I don't know what, but sort of to tidy it over. And instead it's saying, well, basically the reason these people rioted was that their lives are miserable in these miserable ghetto slums. And, they're still, they're poor. They're beat up by the police, just the things that are pretty well known now. But back then, you would say, no, that's just a myth. So in the same way, apparently, the parliamentary committee about the Paris Commune had a little blip of where they weren't thinking, and they said something completely straight. And so Debord quotes it. And he says, equal right to all the goods and pleasure of this world, comma, the destruction of all authority, comma, the negation of all moral restraints, dash. In the final analysis, these are the aims behind the March 18th insurrection and the charter of the fearsome organization that furnished it with an army. That would be the First International. So Debord picks that as the thing, like what is at stake here when you're talking about the proletariat and so on. He's just finished saying that the spectacle creates this world where abstractly, like in principle, the society is very powerful. We could do anything, not anything, but a lot, with all the technological and means and so on. But at the same time that it produces that, it produces its concrete lack of freedom. Like all this stuff has not, and then he's leading into this proletariat chapter. And so, and the proletariat chapter is saying, what's at issue here? Life. They want to live, basically. That's why they're revolting. So then, this chapter is basically roughly the last 200 years of social conflict, starting maybe in the French Revolution or thereabouts, but particularly a little bit later where Marx and Bakunin and various people like that come into the picture. And so he says, number 73, the real movement that transforms existing conditions has been the dominant social force since the bourgeoisie's victory within the economic sphere. And this dominance became visible once that victory was translated onto the political plane. The development of productive forces shattered the old productive relations, and all static order crumbled into dust. Everything that was absolute became historical. So the bourgeoisie was actually in power de facto because of its control of the economy, even 300 or 400 years ago, or at least it was sort of in play. But it wasn't until really the French Revolution, in particular. You also had the American and British revolutions that were kind of leading up to that, where you had it translated into the political realm. Because up till then, you still had absolute monarchs who were ostensibly in power, even though the rich people could actually tell the monarch to go fuck himself. They weren't going to give him a loan unless he did, etc. So after the French Revolution, this was now visible. The bourgeoisie has visibly done it. And once that's happening, then it doesn't stop. That real movement, that was a historical movement, and it was made by bourgeois people, leaders, like Robespierre and Danton and people like that. Or in the United States, people like Jefferson and Washington and, Adams and et cetera. And once that is there, then it doesn't stop. And there's an undercurrent, which is the proletariat, basically, that is taking part in those earlier struggles in the French Revolution, et cetera. But when the French Revolution is done, and then you get Napoleon coming in and so on, kind of bringing it back, and then there's a restoration, they don't get their own thing. Well, by a few decades later, the proletariat, like the workers, are starting to say, hey, we aren't exactly in the same boat as these bankers and business owners who were rallying us to fight the king or the aristocracy. We have our issues, and when we express those issues, suddenly they bring out the police and all this. So then you have further struggles, which in the 19th century and leading up nonstop to our time, when people are thrust into history and forced to take part in the work and struggles that constitute history, they find themselves obliged to view their relationships in a clear and disabused manner, which was not the case 50 years earlier. This history has no object distinct from what it creates from out of itself. Although the final unconscious metaphysical vision of the historical era, that historical era, considered the productive progression through which history had unfolded as itself the object of history. As for the subject of history, it can be nothing other than the self-production of the living people becoming masters and possessors of their own historical world and of their own fully conscious adventures. So I'm going to comment on that a little bit. So in the earlier times, people thought things like the king is there because of divine right, or the nobles are there because they're nobler than us and they deserve, they're more heroic or whatever. And so they get to boss us around, and various other reasons that might have come up. But once this stuff starts shattering, like after the earlier bourgeois revolutions, that's no longer, you can't do that anymore. History comes into play. Before then, nobody ever talked about history. History was just a relating of things that had happened. But now they talk about it as it's something that moves. We can make history. We can change history. It doesn't matter if there have always been slaves. We can abolish slavery. It doesn't matter if there's always been nobles. We can abolish nobility, etc. And so then I'm going to move on here. One other thing. The class struggles of the long era of revolutions initiated by the rise of the bourgeoisie have developed in tandem with the dialectical thought of history, the thought which is no longer content to seek the meaning of what exists, but which strives to comprehend the dissolution of everything that exists, and in this process breaks down every separation. So I'm going to stop there. We've had a few theses, and then we're going to get back and we're going to talk about what he's leading up to, which is Hegel. That'll be a whole other thing. So any comment on these last few, Mike?
My observation is that it's that the bourgeois revolution not only came with the destruction of Dieu et mon droit and l'État c'est moi. It also came with its own ideology of that replaced it with national sovereignty and democracy, and those two things, I think, weigh like an Alp, so to speak, on the consciousness of the working class, and that sort of. I see it all the time. Class collaboration is nationalism, is what I call it. The acceptance that the nation state is sovereign, and the acceptance that you actually live in a democracy under class rule, and it's possible to create an equality of classes. I think he's being. I think it's a correct observation that Debord is making, but on the other hand, I've come to the conclusion that it's a bit too optimistic about the consciousness of the proletariat as it does its revolts. It doesn't realize.
No, he's not saying that. He's talking in a kind of Hegelian terms, which we will get to it very soon.
Sure.
Anyway, I would just say no. He's not saying that those people all situationists or something like that, or all Marxists. But we will get there. Peter. Unmute yourself.
There, unmuted.
There you go.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting set of about 5 theses here. So 71 and 72, it's interesting what he's saying, that the spectacle or capitalism wants us to believe that the things that exist are eternal, right? Like this idea of capitalism and commodities and wage labor, and yet it's constantly undermining itself and creating these contradictions. On the other hand, he's also saying here that it's also produced an era in which the proletariat, most of us, can actually understand this, right? And we're starting to develop in the direction where we say, hey, we can actually take control of this. We can create a world that we want, right? And so 75, smacks to me of Feuerbach, the theses on Feuerbach, right? Where he's saying, the thought is no longer content to seek the meaning of what exists, strives to comprehend the dissolution of everything, right? It seems like what Marx is saying, right? We're not just going to interpret the world, we're going to change it,
Yeah.
and we're getting to this point where we can actually do that.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm just going to continue plunging in here. This is going to be one of the more complex theses that we'll deal with, because it's a long thesis about Hegel, and Hegel is pretty difficult at best, and it's not necessary for any of you to go try to read Hegel, and if you did, many of you would get discouraged and say, what is it? What's going on here? I actually found that it works the other way around. Like somebody said, well, reading Hegel help, understand da da da. And I found, when I discovered the Situationists back in around 1970, I was an anarchist. And so I hadn't actually really read Marx. I mean, I might have dipped into the Communist Manifesto or something, and, I sort of vaguely knew. Marx was like a no-no. He was one of the bad guys because he was authoritarian, supposedly, and blah, blah, blah. And so, and I certainly knew absolutely nothing about Hegel. So when I was caught by the Situationists, like, oh, this is really great. I'm very intrigued. This is brilliant. They're doing all this thing. So I would, for example, read On the Poverty of Student Life, which we read last fall. And I would think this is great. This is, wickedly, accurate and all these things. And at the same time, it's kind of poetic and, just very challenging. And I would look at, say, for example, the chapter titles, to make shame more shameful by giving it publicity. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2 is, it's not enough that theory must seek its realization in practice must seek its theory. And chapter 3, to create at long last a situation that goes beyond the point of no return. And I thought, boy, that's great, and then I realized shortly afterwards, those are all Marx, this supposedly boring economical guy, that, and so anyway, obviously I started reading Marx. And then when I read Marx, then you have Marx criticizing Hegel. And I said, well, what's it? And the Situationists occasionally mentioning Hegel. So it took a little while before I got back to that, but I found that it was, I was working backward instead, like the Situationists, which I could understand pretty much because I was doing these things after some experimentation. That enabled me to understand what Marx was doing. Otherwise, I would have just thought he was writing boring economic tomes. And reading Marx, then I say, oh, so that's why was Marx based so much on Hegel? And he's always criticizing Hegel. It's because Hegel was his foundation. And so then I go back and I can read at least parts of Hegel, seeing them through Marx or situationist eyes, so to speak. And so that's my relation with Hegel, is that I've read a lot of Hegel and understood some of it and not understood much of it, but enough that I ended up using Hegel. You know, for some of my writings, I would come upon a sentence, I say, oh, that he's got it. You know, just and the reason that he had got it was that he was doing a similar thing that Marx was doing, who was doing a similar thing that Debord was doing. And so anyway, this is just to say we don't have to, you don't have to go read Hegel, but I'm going to try to explain a little bit, and Debord is doing the same thing here, trying to say, what was the position of Hegel here? Well, Hegel was this German idealist philosopher, late 18th century, early 19th century. And he was not a radical, particularly. I mean, in his life, you know, he was just a professor, and he wrote, you know, tomes or gave lectures to, you know, philosophy and so on. But there was something about his philosophy that kind of culminated, it sort of synthesized a lot of previous philosophies that had been in what you might call static societies. You know, societies where not too much was going on, and you had philosophies that kind of went with that. Well, Hegel was living through the French Revolution and Napoleon. And so Hegel, when he's writing about history, which he did, the philosophy of history, as well as the history of philosophy, etc., he's trying to figure out, how does this all cohere? And if he makes his system like, oh, well, history is the spirit of something is, you know, expressing itself in these different ways, different cultures, whatever. And when he gets to the present, he can't say, this is how it is, because it's changing. In fact, it's changing dramatically almost before his eyes. And so he has to, if he's going to make a new philosophy of history that makes any sense at all, has any credibility, it has to allow for this change, these revolutions. And so Hegel's philosophy then ended up having a kind of dynamism to it that, you know, kind of matched history and matched the other thing, not just in history, but the changes in the arts and in sciences and so on. And so it kind of, it then would have a sort of claim to be the philosophy of the world as culminating now. And so Marx is the next generation or two under that. He and Engels and other Germans of their era studied Hegel. I mean, that was what was the latest thing then. I mean, it was pretty hard, but, you know, they did it. You know, they read all these tomes. And so then when they're these youthful, you know, kind of questioning people, and they start seeing, oh, there's a little bit of sign of revolt over here, or dissatisfaction over here, or you know, the monarchy's been overthrown over there, and all that. And so then when they're trying to talk about that, their first impulse would be to talk in Hegelian language, because that was the modern language. So they would try to do that, and then Marx would find, well, wait a minute here. Hegel is writing a thing called the philosophy of right, which is kind of political philosophy, and he comes to these certain conclusions. And some of these conclusions might be rather conservative or reactionary even. How does that happen? Well, that's because there's a flaw in what he's doing. He does have the right thing, that there is a dynamism here, but he's treating it kind of idealistically, like top down, so to speak. And so Marx comes up with the idea, what if you kind of flip that and say, well, yeah, there's a dynamism in history, but it's not in these ethereal, philosophical or ideological realms. It's like what's happening in the real material life. Like when people invent a new machine, or when people revolt, or when people do this. So in so doing, a lot of Marx and Engels, even though they developed in their own thing over the next half century, they're in a way, they're still carrying on some of the stuff, the forms that Hegel invented or developed. So that's why this is, so a lot of this thesis, which I'm about to read, is quoting bits of Hegel, and it's quoting bits of Marx critiquing Hegel and things like that. So, and remember the thesis before that, we have these class struggles develop in tandem with the dialectical thought of history. And he's sort of referring to Hegel. Maybe not just Hegel, but Hegel is the obvious star. These things are developing alongside Hegel's thing and Feuerbach's thing and Marx. You have that sort of sequence in there, and each one is lending insight into the other. So for Hegel, the point was no longer to interpret the world, but to interpret the transformation of the world. A different thing. But because he limited himself to merely interpreting that transformation, Hegel only represented the philosophical culmination of philosophy. He seeks to understand a world that develops by itself. In other words, without human, not something that you can do anything about. It just does it. Just like people would previously have said, that's God's thing working in history. This historical thought is a consciousness that always arrives too late, a consciousness that can only formulate retrospective justifications of what has already happened. You look at these things, Hegel looks at, and he says, okay, yeah, we had a French Revolution, and then that developed into Napoleon, that developed into a restoration, and and he can sort of rationalize, why did those things happen afterwards? That's easy to do. But so he can retrospectively do that, but Hegel is not doing what Marx ended up doing, namely saying, this thing is happening right now. Why is that happening? Where is it leading? What are the options? That kind of thing. Because Hegel is sort of dealing with it after it's already done. So you could say he's revolutionary in the sense that he's writing about revolutions, acknowledging that they exist, but he's not promoting them. And because of that, he's not really understanding them. He can understand them sort of from outside. He can see, well, we can see why people would do that. But he's not adding in his thing, like how could that be adjusted or improved and so on. So Hegel has thus gone beyond separation only in thought. Hegel's paradoxical stance, his subordination of the meaning of all reality to its historical culmination, while at the same time proclaiming that his own system represents that culmination, flows from the simple fact that this thinker of the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries sought in his philosophy only a reconciliation with the result of these revolutions. And then Debord quotes this little piece by Karl Korsch, very admirable guy who I highly recommend. And this is a thing that he wrote called Theses on Hegel and Revolution back in the 1930s. It's just about a page long. And here's a quote from that. Quote, even as a philosophy of the bourgeois revolution, Hegel's philosophy, does not reflect the entire process of that revolution, but only its concluding phase. It is thus a philosophy not of the revolution, but of the restoration. A very neat and accurate thing to say. So then Debord once again, Hegel performed the task of the philosopher, namely the glorification of existing conditions, in quotes, for the last time. But already what existed for him could be nothing less than the entire movement of history. Hegel would be incapable of just saying, yay for this monarchy or that I'm living in or something. Doesn't make any sense. He wants to be able to say, if he is going to praise that monarchy, he wants to somehow rationalize that this thing is the culmination of history. History has been working towards that. Since Hegel nevertheless maintained the external position of thought, this externality could be masked only by identifying that thought with a pre-existing project of the spirit, capital S, of that absolute heroic force which has done what it willed and willed what it has done, and whose ultimate goal coincides with the present. Philosophy, in the process of being superseded by historical thought, a different matter, has thus arrived at the point where it can glorify its world only by denying it. Since in order to speak, it must presuppose that the total history to which it has relegated everything has already come to an end, and that the only tribunal where truth could be judged is closed. So in the next short thesis, here's an answer to that. When the proletariat demonstrates through its own actions that this historical thought has not been forgotten, its refutation of that thought's conclusion is at the same time a confirmation of its message. I'm going to break down that thing. So the proletariat, of course, Debord is looking back at more than a century of social struggles and so on, but even in Marx's day, in the 1840s and 50s and so on, there were proletarian struggles, there were worker struggles, and they were rather isolated and, primitive in ways, but they were starting, to have their own thing and not just following along with the bourgeois leaders and parties and so on. So when the proletariat demonstrates through its own actions this historical thought has not been forgotten, i.e., the thought that Hegel was sort of groping at and that Marx was bringing to the fore. They're demonstrating that because they are acting in a way that implies, okay, we are entering into history. We are taking part in changing things or trying to change them. So when it does that, two things happen. Its refutation of that thought's conclusion. Okay, when it does that, it's refuting Hegel's conclusion. Because Hegel is wanting all this to come to a dynamic development and kind of come to the present and stop. And that's the culmination. And they're saying, wait a minute, that's not it's still going. We're not stopping there. So they're saying, Hegel, you are wrong there. Obviously, they never heard of Hegel, but that's what they're implying by their actions. But at the same time, their refutation of that conclusion is at the same time a confirmation of its method. That is, at the same time, those workers revolting or doing whatever they're doing are also confirming, verifying Hegel's method, this dialectical method, which, because of its dynamism, Marx and Engels end up taking over and, adapting it. But they're using this kind of dynamic mode of thought, that says this thing develops into that thing, this thing develops into its opposite, this kind of thing. The thing that other philosophers were clueless about. because they're used to this sort of, well, it's either A or not A, and this kind of thing. With Hegel, you get this, he's looking at a dynamic world that changes, where something starts out and then it changes into its opposite. Things start, there's all kinds of things going on here that a philosophy worthy of the name would have to account for. And Hegel tries to account for them, but at the same time, he has this sort of closed system because it's an idealistic system, spirit system. So he's just, and so when these workers are doing this, they're saying your conclusion is wrong, but your method is right, so to speak. So I think we'll stop there, and questions or comments. Sid, unmute yourself. You're still muted.
What I said was, is that, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
This is really fascinating, but sort of a little difficult for me. And I'm wondering if you
Only a little?
Right. The whole dialectics, I've been
very.
hearing that a lot, and I even use that word myself in my own discussions sometimes, but I'm not really sure I understand what it means. And
What word is that?
could you give it you said dialectics is like
dialectic, yeah.
Dialectics being sort of in a discussion of like how things are moving along the world. It's for
We're
history.
You're
something starts and then changes to its opposite.
Yeah.
That's I'm trying to get it.
Yeah. I mean, there's no easy thing. I mean, people write whole books about what does this mean and how is Hegel's different than Marx, is different than Lukács, is different than Debord, all these things. And so there's all I can do is emphasize the sort of ground thing is that it's dynamic, that things are flexible, that many people previously thought were not flexible. They thought this is a bad guy, this is a good guy. Well, with Hegel, sometimes the bad guys are the good guys, not because they're morally good, but because they kick into, they make things happen. So there's a thing where Marx quotes in one of his writings, it says the bad side of history that sets history in motion. So the naive standard is, well, this was a bad guy. Bad for him. That's a good guy. Yay for him. And you look back in history and say, oh yeah, that was a cool guy, and that was a bad, and this. And that's just naive. So Hegel, remember when I was talking just a bit back about the cunning of the commodity? There was one of the theses talked about the cunning of the commodity, where the commodity form, the essence of it, doesn't risk itself. It's just there. And the individual commodities go out and then they get destroyed. Just like the spirit of history, according to Hegel, it keeps going. It's just, but the people and things that embody it, that carry it out, they all get destroyed. And the spirit doesn't give a shit about that. The spirit will raise up Napoleon and then lower him down. It'll raise up Stalin. Whatever the spirit seems to want to do, it wants this country to conquer that country so that culture can be spread, or whatever Hegel thinks good thing is. And he will say, well, these other things are leading into that, instead of making moral judgments about how we all want to be good or something, yeah, that doesn't really have anything to do with anything. So,
so like Trump is not necessarily a bad guy. Maybe there's
not
some
necessarily. I mean,
reason in history that he's around right now.
yeah, I mean, of course, Trump is a disgusting individual by any standard. But yeah, I mean, it's conceivable that we could look back 10 years from now and say, man, that was great that he came. Like, he really kicked things, if we'd had the usual business as usual guy there, the earth would have gone, maybe he did something weird, to kind of bring it all out in the open or something.
Right.
Anyway, the point is that you can look at social struggles, for example, and not say, who are the good guys? Or so, you
Right.
look at them and saying, what's happening here? There's lines of force going on. And it could be that this is why both Marx and the Situationists, in their different ways, may look rather ruthless when you look at them from outside. They just make a comment like, this people, this dictator or something, killed 300,000 people, and then go on to the next sentence. Whereas the normal liberal person said, oh, this atrocious dictator killed it. Oh, this is terrible. How, we must stop. They're not doing anything about it, but they'll make a big fluff about, that they disapprove of it or something, which is meaningless. Whereas the Marx and the Debord type will just say, what's going on here? It's like a machine is coming. And if you want to not get destroyed by the machine, you want to know how the machine functions. And you would say, this machine has a sensitive point here. If we can just plunge a screwdriver in there, we can bring it to a halt. And it has nothing to do with plunging a screwdriver into the most evil part of the machine or something like that. It's utterly irrelevant. We just want to know what's going on. And this machine has a thing that goes in a certain way. And so,
and are you referring to history as a machine?
For example, or it could be something like, say, climate change or capitalism or something, some big force that's going on, and how are we going to deal with it? And often we try to deal with it and say, well, I approve of this, or if we only get this leader who has good intentions or something, and they're not really looking at what's going on. And what's going on might be like a hurricane. You're not going to solve it by good wishes. You're going to solve it, if anything, by finding out what causes hurricanes, etc. So if you wanted to do that, then you might be doing something about climate change or whatever. But often when you read these things, these articles and so on, or like Society of the Spectacle, it sounds very cold and dry. Occasionally there's some exceptions. So it's quite obvious that Debord is passionately interested in changing the world. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't decide in this one, I'm just going to be completely dry. Because there's no reason for, in this context, it's completely stupid and worthless to throw in polemical, things about my opinions about this or my feelings about that, or that I dislike dictators or something. He's just going to talk about what and
so what would you how would you speak or think about the phrase the dialectical thought of history in number 75?
Okay.
I mean, the whole thing sort of makes sense to me in a way. It seems kind of basic.
Yeah.
But
yeah, the dialectical thought of history, like I say, it's Hegelian Marxist, you might say, thought. It's a way of looking at history that sees history developing dynamically. And that can see things. For example, a dialectical thing is like the more power, the more things the worker produces, the poorer he is. I mean, that's weird. Why does that? And few people would have even, at most, sometimes people will say something like that and they say, well, it's ironic, that this person who's working so hard, doesn't, well, there's nothing ironic about it at all. It's exactly what you would expect if you understand what's going on. And what's going on is that the worker is producing things, but they are alienated from the worker. He doesn't own them. And he's not even deciding which things to make. He may be making weapons that will kill him or kill other people like him, etc. But that's a fact. And so Marx is just saying that, and he doesn't necessarily say, oh, this is bad. This is it, yeah, he's just saying this is what's going on. And it kind of reveals the hypocrisy of the official liberal society that says, oh, the workers are working at this in order to make things for people. Isn't that wonderful? And aren't the capitalists wonderful? They're giving the workers a chance to earn a living. And, all these silly things like this, that are just not knowing what's going on or how it develops. Because the political economists, the ordinary professors and so on of that time and ours tend to look at this thing and they say workers go to the factory and the stores distribute this and as if that's just the way things are. And it's always been that way and always will be that way. And they're not even looking at the fact that it's completely irrational and nonsensical. And the reason they aren't looking at it that way is that they're accustomed by their very habits and customs to not see that. They see that it's just they're seeing it externally, like, oh, that's just the way things are. It has to be. If we didn't have money, how would we do things? If we didn't have this, then who would pay for that? And blah blah blah. And Marx is looking at this and says, there's something very weird here. These things that are supposedly helping the worker are making the worker in a worse position. You've developed all these technologies, which you would think would do a lot to free up human time and so on. And all it does is that you've created these big factories where thousands of workers will come there and go to an early grave because they're working 16 hours a day and they're unhealthy and they can't afford, blah, blah, blah. And it's not just a moral thing. I mean, there were moral people like Dickens and stuff like that going in and said, this is awful. What can we do about it? And their solution is people should be more charitable or something. Yeah, they're not really looking at how the system works. They're just thinking it would be nicer if the Scrooges at the top became like Scrooge and kind of turned over a new leaf and became more generous and loving. They're not looking at what's actually going on. When you look at what's going on, it's dialectical. And that's what.
So is it sort of, do you think of it as sort of the difference between looking at what exists and what could exist, or?
Yeah, but it's more than that. It's not just that. That's an aspect of it. If you do those two things, you could be what they called utopian. You're looking at this, this is bad, so this would be how it would be good. But you're not making a connection. And that's why Marx and Engels criticized the utopians. They said they're just sort of treating this as if, well, yeah, they see that society is fucked up. But then they think, well, the solution, I've been thinking about this, and if people would just organize cities like this and do this, then we'd have a great time. And so can I sign you up for that? They're not, and of course, in most cases, they don't sign up anybody for it because it's obviously not practical. They're not looking at how you would get from point A to point B. So Marx and Engels a lot of times stress, one reason they don't talk too much about the future good time that they're aiming at is they're concerned with what's going on now. The future will come out of that. But they want to look at what's going on now, like that there are struggles going on now. What can we say about those? Are they good? Are they foolish? Are they promising? Why? And so then they'll analyze, well, this was good, but this, so what they're doing when they analyze like that, dialectically, they're helping the people that are struggling. Because if you're doing something and somebody says, hey, that's very good that you're doing there, but you might want to, they're not even necessarily making a suggestion. They're just pointing out that if you go here, these things tend to result. Do you want that? Oh, no, I hadn't thought about that. So they're encouraging people to have their own thoughts, their own experiments, their own things in the direction of revolt. So that you don't get a revolt that's just sort of on the spur of the moment, and then people don't know what to do. They sort of are successful for one day, and then the next day they don't know what to do. Where do we go from here? Because they haven't thought about it. But also maybe their mode of doing has some flaw in it. For example, if people are following a leader to do a good thing, then the habit of following the leader may become an impingement when they get a little farther on. They're saying, well, where's that guy who's supposed to tell us what to do? Because we're used to this genius, who may have been some good leader, suggesting good things to do. And now we're in a new situation and our leader is arrested, or our leader has become megalomaniac and wants to be the new king or whatever. Now what do we do? So the Marxes or the Debords or, other people like this are, when they write stuff like this or gives talks or communicate in whatever, they're trying to help people do that for themselves because they have to do it for themselves. The Marx and the Debord can't do it. They can do what one person can. They can have some suggestions and so on, but they can't, to do it, you need thousands of people doing something, and you have to take that where it comes. And so they'll look at those struggles like the 1848 revolutions in France and Germany and Paris Commune and so on, and say, well, here's what's going on, and try to clarify, oh, this thing is in, so I'm going on too far here.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip over you because you've already talked a lot. Peter.
I'm going to hold up my Hegel totem.
Philosophy of
whenever
history,
yeah. So the philosophy of history, this is what Debord is kind of referencing here, and Marx is referencing. Like, it's honestly, I recommend, if you're looking to get into Hegel, this is one of the easier ones, and it's not easy, but it's actually pretty readable. These two theses, I think, sum up Hegel in such an amazing way, right? I mean, he's saying that Hegel has kind of gotten to the point. I don't think bourgeois historians have gotten past Hegel, right? I mean, Hegel has understood history in an inverted manner, but he's understood it, like you said, as something dynamic. But he gets to the point in this book where he says, hey, but the end of history is basically Prussia in the 1830s, right? We're free. And then I think it's so fascinating. Debord, in just a couple of lines, says, well, that's all BS. The workers are actually understanding the real movement of history, and it's kind of moving past all these philosophers, right? This class struggle, and actually fighting for change. And so it's really, I just want to say that I just think it's a great little two. The big one and the little one are just great together. These theses.
I mean, they're not saying it's all BS, because remember the second half of the thing. They're saying there is something here. That's why Marx, even though Marx and Engels later stopped mentioning Hegel so much, in the early 1840s, they were writing whole books just to critique Hegel, because it was like this was this immense thing they had to get around,
Right.
And they did that because Hegel was credible. they didn't do it because he was just a bunch of hot air, you know. So even though later they didn't mention him so much, in looking back, Debord and Lukács and people like that can later go back and say, well, of course both of them are being still very Hegelian, even though they don't talk about it very much.
Yeah, I guess
sort of
I was
internalized the dynamic, you know.
I guess, yeah, I don't mean it like that. Just kind of the work, you know, the material force of history. It's
Yes.
showing that what Hegel was, maybe he came too early. He couldn't see that the workers were, that's where the real movement of history was. I agree with you though.
Right, yeah. Okay, Mike, I'll get to you now. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to point out that that my reading of Hegel is a little different. That the end of history kind of thing is where you reflect on what's happened. That's basically Hegel's position on philosophy. Is you don't promote anything. You reflect on it, and the opposite is Marx's position. Is you try to change it. So it's reflection, action kind of thing. And the other thing that about Hegel is that that he's an idealist, and the idealists are people who put the idea that people create above them as a God that moves them through history. So history doesn't end with Prussia. It just keeps going along the path toward with what he reifies as objective spirit toward freedom, which is God, right? And Marx turns him on his head and says, no, we create religion, we create God, and we are the ones that can change history. So that's basically the critique of idealism, that you know, the separation of power, of agency in history. This is I think what Marx and Debord are trying to get at.
Right. And actually, Hegel himself admitted this, because when Hegel is talking about philosophy, he says it only comes at twilight, you know, you know, and he says
when the owl of Minerva,
the owl of Minerva, which Minerva is Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom, and so the goddess of wisdom takes flight just as night is coming on. So he's saying, I think you make a good point, not just that it's in 1830, but wherever we are, we philosophers are just looking back and reflecting. You know, whereas Marx is saying, you know, we want to do something moving toward the future, not just retrospectively saying what happened. Zach, unmute yourself.
Yeah, just did. I have no claims to being particularly knowledgeable about Hegel, and I would love to deepen my understanding of Hegel. But one of the impressions that I have, and it's true of Hegel and true of Marx, who inherited it from Hegel, and to some degree true of Debord, who inherited it from Marx and Hegel, is this belief that history has a logic, that there is a historical process. One can't change it, one can accelerate it, one can guide it perhaps a little bit, maybe, or make incremental changes, but there's a historical logic that leads to some kind of progress, however each of these individuals defined it. And what's always thrown me is, you know, there's a lot of, you know, much of the 20th century would seem to disprove that notion. And I saw you shaking your head, so I'd be very curious to know why it's wrong to interpret Hegel as, and to some extent Marx, as believing in a logic of history that one has to work with, understand through understanding, become more effective in.
I would say, okay, that Hegel certainly thought there was a direction of history, and that Marx sort of de facto thought there was. But Marx didn't, I mean, Marx arrives at these contradictions of capitalism and that, and so he thinks that out of those things, you know, that that it's virtually inevitable that this is going to happen, and that if you looked at that happening, you would say, well, that is definitely progress. You know, that's a good thing. It's not that history itself had a reason, like, you know, a billion years ago, like we're going to aim at this, but he's saying that in fact, for all the miseries of history, we are at a cusp here where if this goes through like it looks like it may do, then we come to a society that is relatively utopian, you know, and we've kind of gotten over the hump finally. Now, Debord, I think, would have somewhat the same things as Marx, except that I don't think Debord would necessarily, in fact, I'm pretty sure he would, if somebody said, well, yeah, but climate change and something like that could just sabotage the whole thing, Debord could say, of course. So, I mean, there's nothing inevitable about this. It's just, you know, there are things that Marx could not picture, like climate change. There, back then, there was, mankind had much less influence on the environment and so on. So you could imagine with Marx, he's just saying, well, no matter how many fuck ups there are on the social level, sooner or later, you know, this is going to lead to this thing. But Debord is in an era where he's going to say, well, not necessarily. I mean, things like climate change could just, you know, abort the whole thing. And then we're just down the tubes, you know, and we're back to you know, a very primitive situation. So in one of his later works, Debord specifically says, anybody who reads this book, it's like an introduction or an afterword to Society of the Spectacle. Anybody who reads this closely will realize it does not offer any guarantees. You know, it's just, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. You know, that things will just sort of automatically turn out okay. So you have to take each thesis in its context with grains of salt. You know, like obviously to say anything, you're going to have to make some statements. The thought of history is combined with it. I mean, you can't make statements like that, which are very useful and elucidating, without sort of fudging things. You know, you're oversimplifying when you make statements like that, and he's making them all the time, just like we all do. For example, if I say we all do, I don't literally mean a billion people on the earth do that, but I mean, a lot of us tend to do that. So I say, we all do it. So if Debord is saying everybody knows that this is true, or all the people of this certain age have the same names, or so, you know, we know what he's meaning. So we don't have to quibble that, of course, if he's describing a sort of progression or sequence that says, following this, you know, this kind of society creates a proletariat where there wasn't one before, therefore it's creating its own negation, implying that a proletariat is kind of going to tend to negate it when they, you know, get numerous enough, etc. It doesn't mean that it's just an automatic thing. It's he's going like Marx did to say, here's a tendency, you know, as to how things happen. So we're getting near the end. I think I'll go along just a little bit more. 78. Historical thought can be salvaged only by becoming practical thought. And the practice of the proletariat as a revolutionary class can be nothing less than historical consciousness operating on the totality of its world. All the theoretical currents of the revolutionary working class movement, Stirner and Bakunin as well as Marx, grew out of a critical confrontation with Hegelian thought. So this is kind of another little continuation of what we've been talking about. Is saying historical thought has to be practical. You could have historical thought like Hegel, or even sort of like Marx if it wasn't practical. You know, you could say a lot of interesting things about history, but he's saying it has to be practical to really realize its own potentials or possibility or essence. And the practice of the proletariat as a revolutionary class can be nothing less than historical consciousness operating on the totality of its world. So he's now bringing this in specifically to these people, these workers, that this is a broad thing that, you know, it's a huge, we're talking about billions of people here, you know, going in these movements. But he's saying that the implication here is that this Hegelian type of historical dynamic thought is so associated with the proletarian revolt that, I mean, they're almost, you can't have one without the other, hardly. And he gives as an example, he says there were various currents of workers' struggles, and a lot of them were not revolutionary. They were just sort of feeble efforts to form a union or get some reforms or something like that, you know, better working conditions or whatever. But he says all the theoretical currents of the revolutionary working class movement. So the ones that were revolutionary, and he exemplifies Stirner and Bakunin, the two different anarchists, and Marx, the non-anarchist. He's saying all three of these contemporaries, they were all in the 1840s or so, all of them were totally marked by Hegel. Even if they resisted Hegel, like Stirner was violently against Hegel, but he had, I mean, that was one of his big fights. He had to fight against Hegel because that was the thought that they were immersed in that time. And Bakunin, the Russian anarchist, comes there, and when he's dealing with social struggles, he has to wrestle with Hegel. They didn't just choose to do it because somebody said you could take a course in Hegel, or you know, you should know Hegel because he's an important thinker or something. There were lots of important thinkers they didn't give a shit about, but they couldn't avoid Hegel, and Marx certainly couldn't avoid it. So that's, again, Debord's thesis is saying that these two or three currents, because you might say Stirner is the individualist anarchist and Bakunin is the collectivist anarchist and Marx is the whatever communist or whatever you want to call it. Those were revolutionary currents. They, I mean, really without quite, you know, they stated as much, they were extreme, you know, they intended to overthrow everything in their various ways. And he's saying all three of them had to go through Hegel, even if only to reject him. And then I'll read, yeah, I think I'll read one more and then we'll stop. The inseparability of Marxist theory, well, actually, I think I'll put that off till next day. We're getting pretty near the end. So any further thoughts about Hegel and dialectic and all that stuff? Or... Okay, we will continue next. I'll be sending out a thing tomorrow morning. And let me know if you don't get something tomorrow. But basically we'll just be continuing. This chapter that we just entered is a long chapter. Will be probably several meetings in it. I don't know how many. But roughly speaking, I recommend that you read the whole chapter just so you'll sort of know what's coming up. But we're going to go through Hegel, Marx, anarchism, the First International, Bakunin and Marx struggling in there, reformist socialism, Bolshevism, the revolutions after World War II, World War I, fascism, Stalinism, and then more or less modern times where we're looking at, well, what's going on now in the 50s and 60s, and ending up talking about workers' councils and stuff like that. So, Bruce, unmute
Yeah, I
yourself.
just wanted to say I just wanted to say there's so much in this chapter. You can't possibly deal with this chapter in one meeting
Oh, no.
because you're looking at the entirety of the history of the workers' movement. I
Yeah.
mean, from beginning to end. I mean, there's, you know, you can chop this up into 3 meetings.
Well, it'll be more than that probably. Yeah, I mean, if we were actually looking at that movement for its own sake seriously, you could take several semesters to study that if you were taking it in academic terms. You could study the 1848 revolutions, that could take months. And then you could study the Paris Commune and the 2 Russian revolutions and all that. Any of those things, people have spent their whole lives specializing in just that topic. And so, yeah, Debord managed to get through all that very concisely, so he's picking out of all the zillions of things you could say about these, just here and there, just this one little essential point about the commune or about, workers' councils or whatever. So we will definitely be spending some more time. And Peter, was there anything in the chat that I should deal with?
It was a pretty active chat. I think you may actually want to glance at it and use it for kind of future discussion. But there's a bunch of stuff in there. You might want to
I always read the whole chat afterwards.
There's a lot in there today.
And sometimes it gives me an idea of something to recommend or whatever. Well, thank you all for being here. And I'll see you 2 weeks from now to continue. We'll be dealing mostly with early Marx and maybe get into the Paris Commune period and anarchism along that. And so look for my email tomorrow and let me know if you don't get one. And those of you in the literary group, I'll see you a week from now. But otherwise, all the rest of you 2 weeks from now. And I will hereby turn off the recording.